We wanted to make sure that we made this news flash pretty prominent because we want to make sure that everyone has all their funding spent and in according to the dates. We certainly don't want to lose any money or have to send any money back. So please take heed to get your reimbursements in and make sure all of your allocation is spent accordingly. Thank you. So we want to welcome you one more time and always to our training sessions. We look forward to being able to provide this information with you and to work collaboratively with you. So today we're going to be talking about managing IDA Part B award and the American Rescue Plan supplemental funding. Tracy Coleman is the director for the Office of Special Education Finance and Budget. Often we call our team the FAB team for fabulous. We are pretty proud of what we're doing, and hopefully we want to be able to be of service to the field and do our best to do that. In saying that, I'd like to introduce to you our staff of the FAB team. And as you know, this is Tracy, and we have Cynthia B, Paul Raskoff, Angela Fennessy, Harriet Dawson, Ella Barnes, Samantha Tansey, Shalonda Lewis, Denise Lawson, and Devin Larson. And I am Joanne Burkota, and we welcome you. Today, our presenter will be Tracy Coleman. Many of you know Tracy. She has worked at the Department of Education for a number of years. Many of you may not know, though, she has worked at the university level and the school division level and in the private sector and with federal programming for a number of years. She's worked in many capacities in all of those institutions. And besides that, she has two beautiful young daughters who are quite gems. So Tracy will be our lead trainer today. These are some helpful resources for you to have available for the presentation. There was a superintendent's memo that went out on July 23rd, and it has all the allocation tables for IDA Part B and the ARP funding. As well, it's always good to have your application in front of you whenever we're talking about managing funding, funds, and your planning. So our purpose today is, our objective is to review the requirements and the necessities for being very prudent fiscal managers of these funds. We're going to look at the purpose of these funds. We're going to look at allocation and budget amendments and what that means, and the reimbursement, things that are required for pre-approval, and what are equitable services, the PSA, and CCEIS, all of you know, that's the Comprehensive Coordinated Early Intervening Services, and CEIS, which is a little different. And then we'll also look at local maintenance of effort and do some frequently asked questions. We have a full agenda today. We actually have 8 sections to this presentation today. So, get ready for putting on your writing instruments and paying attention, because we're walking our way through this process. And our section 1 is about purpose, allocations, the application, and the budget timeline. Tracy, are you ready for us?
Ready to go, Joanne. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited about the opportunity to speak with you today about the special education funding application and the process going forward. It's a great thing to have additional funding that has been made available or possible through the American Rescue Plan. The funding pretty much takes the same rules, require the same types of tracking and reporting as regular IDEA funding. There will be some differences as it relates to the capturing of information from that perspective. But overall, I want to make sure that each of you understand that the funding made possible through the regular IDEA funding and the ARP funding, which is considered supplemental funding for the federal fiscal year 2021, is really to support the excess costs beyond state and local funding to provide FAPE for students with disabilities. And it's also to help recover from the impact of the coronavirus pandemic and safely reopen school to sustain operations. And I want you to think about that as we move forward in considering how these funds can be used, some things you guys want to consider as schools are reopening and the pandemic and the year and socio-emotional needs of students throughout the presentation and how to address some of those needs. Next slide, Joanne. As Joanne mentioned, there was a superintendent's memo dated July 23rd. That superintendent's memo outlined the funding that was made available through not just the ARP funding, but regular IDEA funding. DOE received $312 million in order to support schools throughout the Commonwealth. $276 million actually goes under 611. A portion of that is made available between July 1 and September 30. And the remaining of the funding becomes available on October 1 once we receive the final grant award notification from USED. And that's true for the 611 component. Under the 619, which is the preschool component and the ARP funding, that program was fully funded by the U.S. Department of Education on July 1st. So the full amount of the allocation should now be available in Omega for school divisions to start working with and submitting budget amendments in order to outline planned uses for the funds. Next slide, Joanne. Applications for the funding under the regular IDEA actually was due on May 16th. We are still going through the approval process. I think we're now down to about 15 school divisions that still need to finalize their submission and make revisions to the application. And I would suggest you guys get those revisions in as soon as possible to ensure your funding is available for you to use right away. As of July 1st, the funding was made available. We received the grant award notification from USED. We had to actually set up separate accounting system or accounting tracking process for the funding. The money will become available, as I mentioned, on October 1st, 2021. And that's true for IDEA as far as the regular component portions became available, but the ARP funding became available on July 1st. So school divisions can start using those funds as of July 1, assuming or if you have a approvable grant application that your division has submitted. As mentioned previously, please ensure your applications are in and all revisions are finalized in order for us to ensure there aren't any delays with funding. Also, I want to make sure there has been practices in the past that you guys may need to make some adjustments locally. One of those practices have been to submit budget amendments or budget supplements as you do reimbursements. You will be required to submit budget amendments and outline the uses of funds under the ARP funding in advance of spending. And those budgets will need to be approved in Omega. And we'll talk a little bit more about that process as we go through the presentation. Next slide, Joanne.
Okay, section 2, we'll be talking, Tracy will go over what is ARP, how the funds can be used, and what are the laws and regulations. This funding is, like we have said earlier, is to help to overcome the effects of the pandemic for all kids with disabilities. Tracy?
ARP funding is somewhat similar for some of you guys that may have been available or around during the ARA. The additional funding that came about, I guess, in 2010 and made available during the 2012 cycle. This particular funding is considered the American Rescue Plan Act. The funds are considered additional appropriations under IDEA, and they're subject to the same IDEA rules as regular IDEA funding. It's not a standalone program. However, there is a different award number and different project codes that have been established. So how does that impact you? What that means is your school division will need to set up a separate way and a separate account code locally in order to track this funding and how these funds are being used. And this will be separate from how you track the expenditures around your regular IDEA funding. Next slide, Joanne. As mentioned previously, this is one-time supplemental funds. So as you think about your spending, think about that at the end of the 2 years. Currently, there are no plans to renew the funding stream. As mentioned, it's not a separate grant, or at least not a separate requirement as it relates to funding. There is a separate grant award number and separate project codes. It's subject to the same rules, same regulations, same reimbursement conditions as 611 and 619, the regular allocation. And as you know, if you've been around for a little while, because of the size and magnitude of the funding that has become available, there will likely be additional, I guess, reports or information that may be asked of us at the federal level. We don't have that information at this point, but I feel pretty confident if you guys set up your accounting at the beginning and maintain sufficient documentation locally, you'll be able to answer any of those questions that may come about at a later date. Next slide, Joanne. Since these items or these funds are one-time supplemental funds and no longer available, school divisions should plan carefully. When you start funding ongoing long-term purchases like personnel costs to hire personnel, just know that once these funds are used, there are no plans at this point for replenishing the funds. When you think about if you're thinking of some level of capital outlay or renovations you guys might want to do, just know that those things will need to be pre-approved, and also think about the timing in getting those things through your procurement process. So as mentioned, the rules are still the same. You still have to go through procurement at your local. You still have to comply with the Virginia Public Procurement Act. You still have to comply with pre-approval requirements, and we'll walk through some of those pre-approvals that will be needed later in the presentation. But most of all, it should be used to assist in overcoming the impact of the pandemic. Next slide, Joanne. If you think about allowable uses, under IDEA, the program is established to support students with disabilities. So in essence, the purchase of items, the personnel, is truly to support students with disabilities. There have been instances where reimbursements or requests are submitted where there are some benefits to, let's say you have an inclusive classroom. If you have an inclusive classroom and a purchase is being made and using IDEA funding, whether that's IDEA regular or IDEA ARP funding, just know that the program intent is to support students with disabilities. So the purchase should be in support of students with disabilities. There are no rules where there can be an incidental benefit to non-disabled peers, but the purchase should be for the benefits of students with disabilities. Also recall, I'm not sure if you're aware that EDGAR, OMB Uniform Guidance, all of those provisions are the same. If you're not sure of what those provisions are, please reach out to a member of the FAB team and we can share those items with you. At the conclusion of the presentation, there are also links to those federal regulations. EDGAR is the Education Department Grant Award regulations, and OMB Uniform Guidance is what took the place of, I guess, A87, if anyone is familiar with that. But that pretty much outlines what the federal requirements are.
Okay, and I got a little bit ahead of Tracy there, but we're moving on to section 3, and get your thinking caps on, because these are all the things that are the requirements for IDA and things we have to set aside and do treat the funding a little bit differently. So Tracy, you want to talk about what we have upcoming?
Thanks, Joanne. Excess costs is another reporting requirement that school divisions must submit in order to gain access to IDEA funds. I'm also going to do a shameless plug and remind school divisions we still have a few, maybe 5 or 6 districts that still need to finalize their excess costs data submission and make revisions in that submission as well. In the regulations, this particular data submission is required for divisions to receive funding. Other requirements has to do with your annual plan or your grant application for funding. That's a requirement to receive funding. Other components that we're going to talk about where it relates to maintenance of effort is a requirement for funding. So ARP funding doesn't mean that or those requirements go away. It simply means that the ARP funding absorbs every last one of those requirements in relationship to accessing the funds and spending the funds. I want to remind you, as a change in practice, all budget amendments must be submitted in Omega in advance of expending funds and needs to be approved in advance of spending funds, especially since school divisions will not be required to submit an amended grant application in order to expend ARP funding. I'll repeat that one more time. School divisions are not required to submit an amendment grant application in order to expend ARP funding. However, school divisions will be required to submit budget amendments or budget transfer requests in Omega in advance of expending funds. That's the only way the department can capture information around planned spending in advance of you expending those funds. So in lieu of submitting the application, divisions will have to submit a spending plan, which clearly outlines how funds will be used. And we have included in the presentation an example of some of those things. I'll repeat one more time. You are not to submit an amended grant application or an amended annual plan in order to access ARP funding. However, you will need to submit a budget amendment in Omega in advance of expending funds for pre-approval. And that budget amendment has to outline planned uses. 1 FTE of a special ed teacher in elementary school, OT/PT speech, what types of purchases you plan to make. The full gambit of your object code budget needs to be pre-approved in advance of spending. Thanks, Joanne. Next. Next, I'm going to go through all the different fiscal requirements under IDEA. And these fiscal requirements are the same under ARP. We're currently in the process of updating or revising the proportionate set-aside application. So if you are familiar with this data submission, just like Title I and other federal funds, there is an equitable service requirement. And under IDEA, that equitable service requirement is captured under the proportionate set-aside requirement. Under the proportionate set-aside requirement, school districts submitted in its December 1, 2020 child count data submission the number of parentally placed private school students and the number of homeschool students in your jurisdiction. Based on that data submission, we now know how many students have been identified for this equitable service to meet this requirement. So as a result, the data submission around the proportionate set-aside will capture not only the component that's required under the regular IDEA funding, it's also going to capture the requirement of PSA under the ARP funding. So in the submission or data submission itself, school districts will need to certify the information, but for the most part, every amount of data that's needed in order to capture this information, we already have. So hopefully the data that were submitted on December 1, 2020 are accurate, because that's the data source that will be used to pre-populate this information. And the data submission is to allow school districts to take record of what the dollar amounts are that you will need to reserve as a result of this requirement. Please note that this amount is based on this data submission. It's not based on preliminary information that was included in your grant application, because remember, that was preliminary. Your actual set-aside amount that you need to maintain and track and keep record of happens to be this proportionate set-aside data submission. Funds are to be spent over the first year of the grant, and any funds not spent within that first year, which started July 1, 2021. The first year ends June 30, 2022. Any unspent balances can be carried forward for an additional year, June 30, 2023. Next slide, Joanne. At the conclusion of the June 30, 2023 cycle, you can then use any unspent balance for other IDEA-related activities, meaning for students with disabilities. So when you're requesting reimbursements, please be sure to use the drop-down button in Omega in order to identify whether that expense is pertaining to the proportionate set-aside requirement. When you submit your budget amendments, please take note that you will be required to set aside funds for proportionate set aside if you were required under regular IDEA. That same rule applies to ARP IDEA. I will repeat once again, because there seems to be a little confusion on this. We've identified this as one point of contention when doing fiscal monitoring, that oftentimes school districts use the dollar amount that has been established in the grant award or in the grant application instead of the amount that has been established based on a data submission for the proportionate set aside. That collection window will open once we receive the actual grant award notification from USCD somewhere around October 1. We will advise districts through SUP's memo when you can log in and submit your data. But please share this information with your finance team, because tracking and accounting for this is extremely important. And we've found instances where it's difficult to find the documentation that supports the providing of services for you to meet this federal requirement. Next slide, Joanne. Next, I'll go into comprehensive coordinated early intervening services. This particular requirement is not true for every school division across the Commonwealth of Virginia. There are about 24 school districts that are required to set aside for comprehensive coordinated early intervening services. There are about either 4 or 6 school divisions that actually volunteer. If you think about it, it's what's best for kids. So if you think about what's best for students, the requirement typically comes about because of a situation in data submission and practices within a school division where students have been overly identified, where there is some significant disproportionality around certain population or subset of students within a district. If, as a result of that data submission and information captured, school divisions have been identified for significant disproportionality, 15% of the Part B, and that Part B means 611 and 619, must be used to address the area of disproportionality. That is also true under ARP if you are one of those school divisions. We have already identified which school divisions are required to set aside for CCEIS. The budgets have already been set up in Omega for CCEIS for all required school divisions. The budgets have been set up in CEIS for voluntary school districts based on your annual plan. If there are any adjustments that need to happen as it relates to setting aside funds for or volunteering to set aside certain amounts of funds for CEIS, just know it cannot exceed 15% if you're volunteering. If you are required, it must be 15% of your Part B. And that Part B now consists of regular IDEA and ARP IDEA. For school divisions that are volunteering, you will need to send an email requesting the amount that you would like to reserve under CEIS to the SPED Finance email. And that needs to be from, at a minimum, the SPED director requesting that amount. And we suggest and ask that you also CC your superintendent. And that way we have the information we need in order to move forward with requesting with our budget office to set aside 15% of your ARP funding as we go forward. And this is really important for those 6 school divisions that have volunteered to use Part B funds for CEIS. For the required folks, we've done the hard computations for you. Budget amendments are extremely important this year. I don't know how to overemphasize that. Budget amendments probably took a back seat in the past. They only took place at the end of the spending at some point through the year. Not really something districts paid attention to, not something that we really harped on or made sure happened. Just know that if you have your workbook, and you should have it by now, and you are submitting your CEIS and CCEIS planned uses for the coming year. Michael Gregory is taking lead on that. We will have additional information around CCEIS for those divisions that are new to CCEIS. And any persons that want to attend, that training session will take place in October. So please be on the lookout for that communication. But you will also need to outline in your workbook the budgets and planned uses of funds for the ARP funding that is being used for CCEIS and for CEIS. It's critically important that you know that. And also, please ensure that you send any written amendments via email to the SPED Finance email address.
Okay, we're going to move on to section 4, which is maintenance of effort. And that is a lot that folks deal with every year in order to make that requirement. We'll be looking at the exceptions for the maintenance efforts and adjustments, which is not something we've used a lot in the past, and conditions for bidding, being able to use the MOE adjustments. Mercy?
Thanks, Joanne. One thing that did not happen is there were no waivers to MOE as a result of the pandemic, which means school divisions are still required to maintain the same level of spending in school fiscal year 2021 as was spent during fiscal year 2020. There are some allowable exceptions and provisions that are made available. We will explore those. Shalonda Lewis takes lead on this data collection. Also be on the lookout for additional sessions. We'll try to hold more sooner with school districts as we realize some districts may be struggling with meeting this particular requirement. And when we work on this particular data submission, typically we have to work one-on-one, extremely close with multiple school divisions throughout the reporting cycle in order to capture the details around this data collection. If you're one of the school divisions that have maintained your spending from year to year and never have to explore the maintenance of effort, allowable exceptions, we're finding that you are now becoming an exception in many cases around the state. And each story is different. Circumstances are different, but just know that we will work as the regulations allow us to in order to identify any allowable exceptions. There are 4 that are listed. There's much more detail in our guidance documents that are available on our website, but just know these 4 are available in the regulations and will be explored should you need to consider those in your data submission when collected in either the late fall or early winter. But we want to have some sessions with you just to make sure you prepare for that as we go forward. Next, Joanne. Under the maintenance of effort, there are actually 4 tests. And under the 4 tests, you either meet your MOE requirement using local expenditures in the comparison year. You either meet it using local plus state expenditures when compared to the last time you met using that particular method. The other 2 options are available based on local per capita expenditures or local plus state per capita. Those are the 4 tests. Should you not meet those 4 tests, you then have the 4 allowable exceptions that were mentioned in the previous slide. This particular provision becomes critically important as an option because you do have an increase in federal funding this time around. And this becomes important next year. However, there are some regulations around the use of this requirement. And that entails if you are a division that are in needs improvement, you will not be able to make this. If you are a school division that is required to set aside for CCEIS, you may not be able to use this. However, the next slide will walk you through what exactly this is and how it may benefit you for those that make it available. And I also want to emphasize that LEAs or school divisions must use the freed up funds in support for other elementary and secondary education act requirements. So you will have to provide documentation and evidence that if you didn't expend the funds, or at least didn't expend special education funding to the level of the freed up funds, there has to be evidence to show that you spent those funding in other areas, and that the funding didn't just simply go away. It was funded by the local boards or your local administrators or whatever the case may be. You have to actually show evidence around the spending. Next slide, Joanne. This particular slide really gives a good example of the adjustment. So in the school year 2020-2021, your federal allocation was pretty significant if you received $10 million. Most school divisions don't receive much, but $10 million. In the 21-22, between the Part B allocation, there is an additional $10 million. Under the Part B ARP allocation, there's an additional $2 million for a total of $12 million in federal funding. As a result of the $12 million in federal funding, 50% of the increase means that you can now reduce or have the possibility of reducing your spending for $1 million. But you got to come up with $1 million worth of stuff and evidence to support it. So that $1 million then have to be used in support of other ESA related activities. And school districts will be required to provide evidence of such. Evidence will consist of financial records to identify which personnel, what equipment purchases, or what other items were used in lieu of using the money for students with disabilities. The district used the money for all students in support of Elementary and Secondary Education Act requirements. Next slide, Joanne. I just want to emphasize that there are some areas where this is not available to some school districts. I mentioned before, if you are in needs improvement, needs intervention, or needs substantial intervention, this option isn't available for school districts to use. If you happen to be a school division that's required to set aside funds for CCEIS, then you will not be able to take advantage of this particular provision in the Act. However, you may not also reduce your reduction automatically. It's something you'll have to contact the VDOE, namely Shalonda Lewis, to let her know you would like to take advantage of this provision, because there are additional reporting requirements around this provision, and evidence must be provided in order to do such. Next slide, Joanne.
Okay. And we're moving on to section 5, which is talking about ARP expenditure considerations. And what's most important, and we find that school divisions have difficulty understanding sometimes, is the necessity for pre-approval of several things, which is about attending meetings or travel or any out-of-state travel and support cost requirements. So Tracy will be talking about that with us. And as you can see, it often tips our world upside down. Tracy?
Thanks, Joanne. If this is the first time many of you are hearing about this, it's not because it hasn't been in your grant award. The information typically is embedded in the instructions and guidance documents and on the requirements sections of your annual plan. But when we talk about the ARP expenditures and considerations and things that may be a little different this time around, is please consider the sustainability of the funding. If anything can be learned from the last time we received an influx of federal funding, and the most recent time was around the ARA timeframe, is that the focus was really around saving jobs. The challenge with that is that jobs typically require ongoing funding. So with the ongoing funding, this particular funding source would no longer be available. So when you're making considerations around how you want to use the ARP related funding, just think about the sustainability. Think about the things that your district will need to do in order to recoup learning as schools reopen. Think about the disruption of the education of children with disabilities. There have been so many conversations around mental health and socio-emotional supports as a result of the pandemic. Kids have experienced, and adults too, have experienced a huge amount of loss over the past year. There have been significant challenges in the communities around how do you address the pandemic? How do you ensure safety of children? Many of these students have been home for over a year, and we're asking them to now come back and feel safe in our buildings. What supports are we going to use in order to make them feel more safe, to reduce the amount of anxiety, not just for the students, but the adults that serve them? Please be sure to focus on the issue around equity in special education and early intervening services. There have been so many issues around the needs of students and the resources to support those. And try to learn if you experience what happened as a result of the ARA funds. As you know, there were audits that were required. Buses and playgrounds. I mean, playgrounds, is that the best use of your funds? How do you bring about change that's going to be sustainable? And typically playgrounds are used for all kids, not just for students with disabilities. So the pre-approval around the buses and the playgrounds will be necessary. If there are large influx of technology purchases that are over $5,000, it's going to require some pre-approval and some legwork for your district in order to get those things approved. I'm not saying it's not allowable, but there is going to have to be some evidence around the allowability and the sustainability around how the activities or things are being used after that particular first year of allocation. Next slide, Joanne. And I'm not going to overemphasize, or I can't overemphasize the need to ensure that you submit your budgets in Omega or pre-approval prior to obligating any funds. So after this session, you need to go to Omega right away and start establishing your budgets and seeking pre-approval. If there are any items that you're planning to make that cost $5,000 or more as it relates to equipment purchases, you need to include that in your budget and submit that in Omega. Participant support costs isn't something that you guys use very often. That's something that's used typically around the state when we provide staff development opportunities for individuals, and we have to pay for participants and we pay stipends and that sort of thing. Pre-approval is required in order for us to do those types of trainings across the state. Typically, school districts are training staff members. So participant support costs is less of an issue. The only thing I want to emphasize is if school districts are paying for parents that are non-employees of your school division to receive training, then you typically have to get pre-approval from the VDOE in advance of that happening. If you think about your local SEAC committees, and if you're paying for things around your local SEAC committee, that's not required for pre-approval because that is included in the regulations, meaning the IDEA regulations. The local SEAC is a requirement in the regs. So obviously you can incur costs for individuals that are not employees of your district. But if there are other costs that you are incurring as a result for conferences and that sort of thing, or training sessions, those things require pre-approval. All employee out-of-state travel, that's less of a concern right now for most school districts, but any out-of-state travel require pre-approval. And please seek that in advance of taking the travel. Next item, Joanne. The conferences and meetings, that has to do a lot with participant support costs. But what I will say, food items, we received less requests for food than we did in the past. But anything involving food and the use, we try to encourage individuals to use non-federal funds if you don't want to seek pre-approval, because evidence will need to be provided as it relates to the program requirements around the use of federal funds for food items. So conferences and meetings, this information is taken straight from USED guidance, and this is made available to you so that you'll know it's something that we all are required to do. Next slide, Joanne. Any reimbursements for travel, any reimbursements for food, again, it's pre-approval and it is required. Non-allowable expenditure include alcoholic beverages, entertainment costs, and there are several that are included in uniform guidance. This is just a segment of those things that we know about that are definitely not allowable under any circumstance. These are in the cost principles. The bullet at the bottom of that particular slide provides that for you. This provides the federal regulation around participant support costs and what that means. That's typically around training where stipends are paid for individuals to attend the training, and we're talking about non-employees. Travel allowances and registration costs. Next slide, Joanne. More on participant support costs. That's there for your reading pleasure, but just know it is a requirement that school districts are to follow should this happen in your school division. Most of you will never have to address this, but in the rare instance that you may, I want you to at least know and be aware of this requirement. Next slide, Joanne.
Okay, we'll be talking about tracking the ARP funding and all the expenditures and reimbursement, and know that when you're planning, plan carefully with the end in mind, and going over budget considerations. Like Tracy has said several times, is planning with the end in the mind, knowing that these funds will not be reallocated again. So these are one-time shot in the arm kind of funding to help boost the divisions. Tracy?
Thanks, Joanne. As mentioned, and you'll hear us say it through the duration, one-time supplemental funds in support of students with disabilities. If you haven't logged into Omega or don't have access to Omega, please find those in your jurisdiction that do have access. You will notice that there's a different, I guess, project code and award number for the ARP funding. So your finance teams will need to set up separate accounting systems or separate account codes in order to account for this money. So work with your localities, work with your finance teams to ensure that you guys can track how these funds are being used. And because they're being tracked separately, there is a unique budget code that's in Omega. You will be required to submit budget amendments in advance of expending funds. And I'm repeating that because that is so different than something that we've done in the past. But it's something that we're definitely going to ensure that we follow, because we are all subject to review and we are subject to audit. And keep in mind that you can use these funds for any IDEA related activity that supports students with disabilities. Just be sure to seek pre-approval by submitting your budget amendments in Omega in advance of expending funds. Many school divisions want to hire staff in preparation for the start of school. Some school divisions have already opened. In those situations, that means you need to get busy and start submitting those amendments now. Include the number of FTE. that you want. Include the titles of the positions that you plan to fund. Include the descriptions around each of the object codes that you plan to use the funding for. There will likely be increased scrutiny around the funding. That just comes with using taxpayers' dollars. And when we use taxpayers' dollars, typically taxpayers want to know how we use those funds, and most importantly, how did it support student learning? How did it support socioeconomic or social needs of students, equity types of issues, socio-emotional learning, whatever the case may be, we'll need to provide that evidence and support in order to move forward. I will remind those who may not have logged in right at 10 o'clock. A new application is not required in order to receive ARP funds. However, budget amendments are to be submitted in Omega in advance of expending funds. That is the only way the department can ensure we meet federal requirements as it relates to approving the use of those funds. And because a new application or a revised application isn't being required, that spending plan becomes your rubric for spending. So ensure that there aren't any issues in the future when you submit the reimbursements. Please try to outline those expenses or those requests in advance of expending. Next, Joanne. The next slide provides you with a screenshot of the budget transfer screen in Omega. The budgets have all been loaded now. You should now have your IDEA 611 regular, your IDEA 611 or 619 regular, IDEA 611 ARP, IDEA 619 ARP. So you now have 4 different categories of spending this year. So as a result, at a minimum, your budget amendments will include 4 different budget amendments in order to capture the spending around the 4 different spending categories. 611 regular, 619 regular, 611 ARP, 619 ARP. Pre-approval required. Details required, not vagueness. This is not the time to be vague. Details, details, details. CCEIS requirements, proportionate set-aside requirements, they're all still required under ARP. Next slide, Joanne. Again, funds will be obligated and must be made available or are made available July 1. If you have not finalized your annual plan, there may be a little hiccup. Please make sure you reach out and submit and finalize all your submissions to ensure there aren't any hiccups with your spending of your IDEA funding, whether that's for ARP and whether that's for IDEA. Your grant application that was due on May 16th, we still have about 15 school divisions that we are awaiting amendments from. Some have submitted amendments most recently this week or last week, and they are going through the review process. But I am expending my time and committing time to ensure we get those through as quickly as we can. So as soon as you submit those, we're jumping right on them to make sure that you can expend your funds, and there won't be any hiccups going forward as it relates to your grant application. I'll say again, I can't say it enough, budget amendments are required in Omega in order to move forward with spending, especially ARP funds. Next slide, Joanne. Reimbursements Your timelines, you have until September 30, 2023. At the very beginning of the presentation, as a friendly reminder again, federal fiscal year 2018 funds were expended or extended for an additional year. So we have a very unique issue going on right now at the Department of Ed, which means our department is currently dealing with the closeout of federal fiscal year 2018 grant. And we still have, I want to say, about 4 school divisions that still have not drawn down all of their FFY 2018 funding. We still have a significant amount of school divisions that have not drawn down their federal fiscal year 2019 funding. And that funding ends September 30, 2021. We will have a significant, meaning every school division across the Commonwealth of Virginia will be submitting budget amendments in Omega, seeking approval for your IDEA regular and IDEA ARP funding at about the same time. So we're about to get flooded with a whole lot of requests. So you want to make sure you get yours in first, because we will get through those as quickly as we can, but we have limited capacity at this moment, and we'll explore how to address the workload as we know what's about to happen. And we will work through the approval process and get those done as quickly as we can. So if you see my name on some things that you're not accustomed to seeing my name on, that means we're all hands are on deck. And we're doing the best we can with what we have, but we're doing what's best for kids, and we're going to support that as best we can at the Department of Education. Please make sure you retain all invoices, receipts. As a friendly reminder, time and effort reports are required for any staff members that are funded through special education. I think a lot of people forget about that. Time and effort reporting. That means evidence that a person that's being paid through special education funding actually worked in special education. And that's required after they work. So if you're using contracts that you give to personnel, if you worked in schools, you already know personnel gets moved from position to position. So at the conclusion of that first semester is always a great idea to have some type of verification that the individual that was paid with special education funds actually did work in special ed. That's also true for positions funded through CEIS and CCEIS. Time and effort reports are required. Next slide, Joanne.
Okay, we're going to move on to section 7, talking about something we haven't talked a whole lot about, but that's so important are the special terms and conditions for IDA funding, amendments to the plan and the funding application, monitoring and audits. That is such an important aspect of what we're doing these days, not only from the federal government, but as you well know, we're required as state agencies to come and monitor and audit funding. And talking a little bit about indirect cost rate. That's a real important issue that folks have had some struggles with also. So Tracy, are you ready?
Thanks, Joanne. I'm not going to read all of these. And you would think that USCD or US government won't have to remind us of this, but this is actually in the grant award notifications. Much of it is from the grant award notification that we received from the US Department of Education. And one thing that makes you chuckle a little bit is item number 4, and that's the prohibition of text messaging and emailing while driving. You would hope that no one has to tell us that. But that's actually in the special terms and conditions document that we received that we in turn have to communicate to you guys. Another one that is a state requirement has to do with intellectual property. The suspension and debarment compliance requirement, sometimes that pops up in local audit. So please be mindful of that requirement. That means you are not to procure goods from companies or individuals that are actually on this particular list. So if you don't have a practice locally to check this particular suspension and debarment list, please ensure that you put a practice in place in order to do that. Monitoring and reporting is required as it is with all federal funds. Next slide, Joanne. And as part of the monitoring and reporting, documentation and evidence is to be made available. I'm pretty sure that if you were a school division where special education was not a major program in the past and may not have been audited in the past by your local auditors, chances are it will rise up to the level of being reviewed locally. And our fiscal monitoring team, in partnership with some of the program improvement team, will work together as well on some of the reviews and monitoring where we can. Indirect cost rates are also can be applied to this. And just know that you are to use your local indirect cost rate, and that information is published by the Department of Education's Finance Office and posted on the website. Next section, Joanne.
We are moving on into our frequently asked questions and answers, and we will be going through these. These are questions that we have received in the last month or so from the field. So hopefully this will help a lot of members in our field. Remember that after we finish this section, we will look at resources, and then we will have a thank you. At that point, I will stop the recording and we will go over the questions in the chat box. So Tracy, are you ready?
Ready, Joanne. These FAQ questions actually were received from LEAs, as Joanne mentioned. And I believe, hopefully I answered those during the presentation. This is just to reemphasize some of the things that we want to make sure that are made clear as a result of the presentation. The first question is, are the ARP supplemental funds subject to the same requirements? The answer to that is yes. They are subject to the same requirements as regular IDEA funding. This is not a standalone program, but should be considered as extra IDEA money. Next slide, Joanne. The next question talks about, can any of the ARP funds be used in any of the regular budget categories? Personnel, salaries, purchase services. The answer to that also is yes. Please seek pre-approval prior to expending those funds. And you are to outline your object code budget in your submission in Omega and explain how you plan to utilize those funds by object code. And please, detail is very important during this process. Next slide, Joanne. Next question, are there any specific requirements for reporting or documenting of the ARP funding? The answer to that is no, but. There is a separate project code that has been established to track and monitor ARP-related budgets and reimbursements. That's not necessarily different than anything else that you do. It's just a different project code and different award number. However, there's also a separate accounting, which means you need to track how you're using the funds locally in your school division. So even though there isn't necessarily any special reporting requirements, the answer to that is no, but. Please know that there will likely be increased, interest around how the funds are being used locally. I'm not sure if your local boards are involved in the decisions, but I'm pretty sure many people are asking questions when they see additional funding coming to the schools. So typically you do have to explain what are you planning to do with the funding, and that will be no different than what you might have to do as it relates to the ARP funding. So no, we're not aware of any specialized reporting. However, if history repeats itself, similar to what happened with ARA, chances are there's going to be increased, concerns or questions around how this benefits students academically or their social, emotional, or educational needs. Next slide, Joanne. Next question is, it seems that an approved 2021 annual plan does not have to be revised and submitted based on the final awards. Does this hold true for ARP funds, meaning no revisions or resubmissions are necessary? The answer to that is correct. A revised annual plan is not needed in order for you to use your ARP funding. However, a budget transfer request in Omega will be required in advance of you expending funds. That becomes our mechanism for approving and pre-approving any uses of the funds to verify it supports students. Next question. We are finalizing our CCEIS worksheet for the mandatory CCEIS set aside based on regular federal 2021 amounts for submission. Is it necessary for the additional ARP funds, which also require set aside, to be outlined in the CCEIS worksheet? And the answer to that is yes. You will need to make sure that you include a separate budget to address how you plan to use the additional CCEIS funding in your workbook. So it will allow you to do additional things around this particular requirement and include that information in the workbook. Next question is, may ARP allocations be used to support personnel? The answer to that is yes, it can. But please remember, these are one-time allocations, and school divisions should plan accordingly if using these funds to hire support personnel. Next question, is public notification of the additional ARP funds required? There is no federal requirement that there is public notification. However, that's true at the state level. Please check with your local boards. Typically, whenever funding increases occur that have not been approved by your seat of government, meaning your board of supervisors or your city council members, that is a requirement that exists at the local level. So you want to make sure that you meet those local requirements as it relates to public notice around this particular funding source. So the state isn't requesting you to hold any additional public meetings, but know that you need to check with your locality and your local policies and procedures around this particular requirement. And last but not least, this particular slide covers some resources that are available. Once the slides become available, hopefully you'll be able to access it by clicking on the links. There's lots and lots of information here, much of which we didn't even touch on, but it does include many of the federal requirements that we refer to as we are reviewing each of your requests for spending or for reimbursement. Thank you. If you need any